Let's do our next example, computing the radius and interval of convergence of a power series. We're always going to start by saying what is the center, so what value of x do we plug in to get 0? So if we plug in x as 0, we get 0, so our center is 0. Now we're going to next do the ratio test, so limit n goes to infinity, absolute value, so we get n plus 1 factorial, x to the n plus 1, over n factorial, x to the n. So we get limit n goes to infinity. On the n parts, remember, I don't need to worry about the absolute value. N is going to infinity, so this is positive, so n plus 1 factorial over n factorial. And then x to the n plus 1 over x to the n, I'm just left with an x to the 1, so absolute value of x. Now let's remember what happens with our factorials. So n plus 1 factorial, that just means n plus 1 times n minus 1, n minus 2, etc. So what's left over is just n factorial over n factorial. And again, if you need to, remember you can always do scratch work to figure that out. So if I had asked you, for example, for 6 factorial over 5 factorial, you would say, well, 6 factorial, that's 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. 5 factorial, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we see 6 factorial really is just 6 times 5 factorial over 5 factorial. So the 5 factorials would cancel and you're left with 6. So here, and we've still got our absolute value of x on the end, so here the n factorials cancel and we get limit n goes to infinity, n plus 1 times the absolute value of x. So now we see something a little different than what we've seen in our previous examples. So as n goes to infinity, n plus 1 goes to infinity no matter what x is equal to. So for any value of x, n plus 1 times the absolute value of x goes to infinity as n goes to infinity. So remember, the ratio test said your series diverges whenever your limit is bigger than 1 or the limit goes to infinity. So what this tells us then is that the series diverges for all values of x except at our center, x equals 0. So if x is equal to 0, then our series is just 0, which does converge. So in this case, our radius of convergence is equal to 0, and we don't have an interval of convergence. The only place where our series converges is at x equals 0. So the series converges only for x equals 0. So again, this was a little different than our previous examples. Our series in this case only converges at the center because we got infinity for our limit for all values of x.